Hello everybody. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes. So if you haven't grabbed a glass of wine and some cheese, do so now. And there are some printed copies of the report. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes. This microphone, is this microphone working at all? It's not. No, this isn't working at all. Yeah. All right. Ooh. And Liz? The tension. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Tower Centre's launch of NewsLynx. This is a very, very, very exciting project for the whole centre and for me. It's been almost 2 years in kind of gestation, and I think if you read the report, you'll see a lot of the value there. The two researchers on this project are Michael Keller and Brian Abelson. I'll leave it to them to tell you what's been happening through the 2 years, and I'd just like to thank the people who fund and the organisations that fund the Tower Centre's work, the Tower Foundation and the Knight Foundation, who provide our research funding. Our panellists, after Brian and Michael have given a presentation, are Blair Hickman, who works at the Marshall Project, Lindsay Green-Barber, who works at CIR, and we're hoping that Sarah Neer from the New York Times will come through that door while the researchers are talking. So, without further ado, Brian and Michael. And don't forget to turn it on.
Yeah. Hi, yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out. We're really excited to share our work with you over the past 2 years. There's been a lot of thought and effort and coffee that has gone into it, so and pastries for that matter. So 2 years ago, we sort of started with a problem, or really an issue, and that was this challenge of measuring impact. And we saw this in various different realms. We saw this in nonprofit journalism, but then also in for-profit media organizations who are struggling with how to navigate this sea of metrics on the web. And what we found very early on is that impact meant very different things to different people. So early on in the project, I talked to Glenn Craymon of the New York Times, who had the unique position of collating applications for Pulitzer Prize nominations at the end of the year. And his process for measuring impact involved printing out mentions, emails, writing handwritten notes, and sticking them in envelopes. And as he described it to me, he knew when a project was impactful when an envelope was really thick. At the same time, there were people like Lindsay, who's going to talk later, who were using more sophisticated means of measuring impact. She was creating taxonomies and web forms. And so the challenge really became, how can we encompass all these different practices and turn that into more comprehensive methodology of measuring impact. One of the things we thought about a lot in the project too was the origins of impact. So this is a quote from Bill Gates, I guess his annual letter 2 years ago, who said, "Without feedback from precise measurement, invention is doomed to be rare and erratic. With it, invention becomes commonplace." And this is here to sort of serve as a signpost of a practice called monitoring and evaluation in the aid and development communities. And this is a practice that has rose to prominence over the last 15 years and has now sort of become the norm. And what it basically revolves around is something called results-based management. So aid and development projects are now, for the most part, required to set goals and determine metrics that they can use to assess how well they met those goals. And this is something that has really become ubiquitous in the philanthropy world and has now sort of made its way into media as well. So now many news organizations, specifically nonprofit news organizations, have to answer the same question, which is, how can you measure the outcomes of your work? Of course, when you're trying to eliminate cases of polio, it's a lot easier to come up with a measurement. You know, you just simply count the number of cases in a country or in a continent, and you can even design more sophisticated randomized control trials to sort of factor in other influences. But when it comes to measuring media impact, the outcome of an investigation, or whether you changed people's opinions on an issue, that becomes a lot harder.
Yeah, so this was one quote that we always liked from Jonathan Stray from a couple years ago, which is, how many times last month did your newsroom get a corrupt official fired? Which I think really synthesizes the problem of it. It is great that you can affect change in some way, or if there's an investigation, but is that the same over and over again? And I think that's kind of one of the biggest problems that we tried to tackle with this. The other part of this also is that, I think, just to put it in kind of context, when we started the project from a few years ago, was when I see some of the Chartbeat folks here, kind of the rise of those platforms, kind of the JavaScript revolution of more sophisticated numbers-based analytic systems made some people worry that, oh, this is now all these capabilities, that's all that's going to matter. And so when we were kind of brainstorming this project and thought of it, that was very much kind of the conversation that was happening, and how to take both into consideration was one of our big goals. I think the quantitative is really important, really interesting, but how can we make a platform that also gives voice to these rarer but also really important events? So we started our research by talking to a number of different organizations, and as Brian said, they all had very interesting and different tasks that they did, but they all kind of boiled down to these kind of four groups. Kind of the first, like a clipping service, looking for mentions of your work, which is not a new idea, but has a lot of kind of digital tools that are available. Google Alerts being one of them. It's now, as we talked about in the report, has kind of fallen out of favor. There's a bunch of others. And then, once you have those discrete events, making sense of them in terms of a taxonomy. Is a law changed? Is that, where does that fit in versus, an important stakeholder mentioned our work and now, articulates the issue in a frame that was, how we kind of presented it and fleshed out. The third is, how then do more traditional numbers fit into it? Numbers are great in that you can tell kind of standard stories and stories over time about your work. You measure one thing today and you can measure it again in a year and it's the same thing. You can actually can start to draw lines. And then the fourth, as we talk about a lot in the paper, is how does all of this sync with what an organization is setting out to do? And I think as we try and emphasize, that's the most important thing, because what organization A measures is going to be completely dependent on what they do versus what organization B cares about. And in the end, we looked at what these organizations were doing. As Brian said, you had a rise, and still do see a rise of kind of these nonprofit investigative newsrooms who are looking for funding. They often have reports they need to publish, and so in the end, they're telling a story about their coverage and about their work, which is kind of a very kind of human or journalistic kind of sense making. And so, as kind of a goal for our platform, we thought, how can we take all of those those four things that you saw before and turn it into something where someone will be looking at it and doing kind of this activity, looking at what did our coverage affect, how did we kind of put our voice into a field, and explain to someone what that was. So I think Brian, turn it back to you and go over.
I think you're.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I had one more or two more actually. So in our interviews with these different newsrooms, this kind of this problem space kind of seems simple. Just go up and collect all the mentions of your site, and then kind of put it together and tell a story about it. And people are, it's very, very frustrating. And that was the big thing that we heard of just how frustrating this whole activity was. So I kind of pulled out two quotes here. One is just about trying to figure out what your goals are. And this was from a public radio station. And so, in some ways, audio listens are the single most important thing we can track, because that drives underwriting and donations, but also mission-driven. And so journalism that affects laws, people's lives, and a sense of themselves and their relationship to others is equally important. So you do have this big tension of, the thing that we're measuring really is kind of what might drive the business, but we also have this other thing And so what is the balance between that qualitative and quantitative, and how do they come together? The other was just about kind of the questions people want answered and the current tools that we saw that were out there. So this one I won't read it all because it's long, but you can read it. The main point was that Google Analytics feels both too complicated and not powerful enough for the questions we want to answer. That really stuck with me. The questions people are interested in is about their audience. It's about how they react to the work, how they feel about the work. A simple thing like, our bounce rate is, the percentage of people that just read one article and leave is high. Or let's say they only scroll down for the first 3 paragraphs of a story. That could be that the story was really well written and they got it in the inverted pyramid sense of it and they didn't need to go any further. And so this frustration and kind of the lack of the insights that were possible, we heard a lot. So we didn't solve all these things, but these were some of the big frustrations in this space. And this is, you might have seen, this is our mascot, Merlin Jones, who kind of powers the site.
So one of the first things that we sort of grappled with was this issue of taxonomy. And what I mean by that is really being able to take these discrete events that happen around an article or a piece of reporting and give them sort of coherent categories that you can use to make comparisons across contexts. So if you have many different people collecting these sort of events around their stories, but then categorizing them in different ways, you don't really have a means of comparing across time, across organization, across subject matter. So it makes it much harder to talk about impact metrics when you can't make these sort of comparisons. So actually, about a year ago, we had a conference here, and Lindsay and some other people from the media and impact communities were here, and it was all around this issue of impact taxonomy. And the tension we were trying to grapple with was, how do you allow an organization to specify the things that are most important to it while also serving this goal of allowing for comparisons across context? And so what we sort of came up with during this conference was a sort of loose system whereby you could apply categories and levels to events and use those to start to think about higher measures of impact. So, should I talk about these a little bit?
Yeah, maybe just briefly.
Yeah, so the idea here is that these are sort of linked together so that you can describe an event. So for instance, an event with a citation category at the level of the media would be like a pickup in another news article or a mention on Twitter, whereas something like a change event at the level of an institution might be legislation getting passed or a politician getting fired or something like that. And so now, as you can see, that these sort of specific tags can then be mapped into these more general categories. And this was our sort of solution for allowing specificity and customization, but while also making that making comparison possible. And this is sort of how it looks in the interface. And you assign colors to all the tags. You'll sort of see where that comes up later. This will probably be hard to read from there. This is generally the sort of flow through the interface. There were sort of 2 main components. One being sort of this component of collecting data about events out in the world, and this is something that we'll probably talk about a little more later, but was really built around the idea of being modular in the sense that things that are important to track today may not be important to track tomorrow. So for instance, today you may be very, very interested in what people are saying on Twitter or Facebook, but perhaps in a year from now there will be a new social media network that you would want to track. And the idea here was to be able to plug in things to this one data collection pipeline without much fuss and without making any assumptions about which things are the most important to track.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, the general one of this, and it's hard to read, kind of the gray block on the left, we have kind of two main parts of the site. One is called the kind of approval river, and what Brian was saying, all of the different services that you want to monitor, you can see in there. And then the other one is kind of the data analysis, more kind of article metric interface. And so we'll walk through those now. This one is, so starting with the approval river, we have this concept of recipes. So there are three here. There's kind of a fuller list on the left. We started off with kind of Google alerts, things on Twitter like a Twitter list. So for instance, if you wanted to monitor all members of Congress for mentions of your work, you would add that Twitter list and then a keyword, so it would be like your domain name. And then in the kind of river list, you would get, sorry, I guess that one didn't go in. But yeah, this just has the modal on it, but you can see in the background you have these kind of alerts. And then you would approve one of those alerts if it was particularly impactful and assign it to an article. So that's kind of this kind of modular flow. You have services, you monitor them for potentially important events, and the person who is in charge of this for the organization would then say, yes, this was important, and assign it. And this is also where you see the different kind of impact tags come into play.
Right.
So they have one choice and say, or multiple choices if they want. This was a citation or media citation event, or this was a story localization, or we got cited by a think tank.
So, and I think it's important to note here that this sort of process very much mirrored the workflows of the people we were talking to. Many of the people who were charged with measuring impact at their organizations would do things like get email alerts for mentions. They would set up if this then that recipes. They would do all sorts of very clever, interesting hacks. And then they would all end up in an email inbox, which they would then sort of meticulously hand enter into a spreadsheet. So in many ways, we were trying to, at the very minimum, make their job easier by reducing these very menial, laborious tasks. And that's a lot of what this interface is designed to do. So the sort of second component of what we're doing, the first component being very much more in this qualitative events in the world type of thing, is trying to contextualize metrics. So we have sort of two different views whereby you can interact with your metrics. This is the sort of summarization view, and each of these columns represents a different metric you can track. It's important to note that these metrics are sort of plug and play. If you want to track page views, you can. If you want to track social mentions, you can. If you want to track attention minutes, you can. It's really up to you to choose which services you want to plug in. At the same time, we really wanted to emphasize the ability to make comparisons. So it may be hard to see, but each of these columns has a sort of gray line in the middle, and that is an indicator of what the median is for all articles across your organization. You can also sort of go into this view over here and say, I want to compare all articles against, the median of every article that I've tagged to be about the environment or about politics. And this is something that we thought was very important in the sense that you could quickly make comparisons across the subject matters that you were reporting on. Yeah. We also were pretty sort of cognizant of not just sort of putting raw numbers up there, so that you could always sort of think about comparisons rather than sort of absolute measurements.
Yeah, and a lot of that came out of this kind of nebulous question people would be asked by their organizations of, oh, how well did a story do? And that's always, well, in comparison to what? And so you put out a package of stories. Well, if you compare that to all of our stories, it's not really meaningful. So let's compare it to a subset. Let's compare it to the last package we did. And we'll see kind of that theme of kind of promoting in context come out in this the other pages of the platform.
So this is sort of the view you see when you drill down to an individual article. And so you'll see a lot going on here. But the key things are sort of your traditional metrics over time thing. I think the three things you would be looking at here are, I think it's page views and Facebook and Twitter. But I think the sort of novel thing that we included is sort of below this, you also have indicators of two different things. One are promotional events. So this is something that you don't really see in many analytics platforms, but I think is very important, is to actually keep track of the effort that you put into promoting your own content. So when you're configuring NewsLynx, you're able to specify a list of your staff members on Twitter, a list of the Facebook pages you manage, your sort of main Twitter account, and potentially down the line we might include things like email newsletters. But the idea here is that when you configure those things, we track all of that and note every time that an article is mentioned from one of those feeds. So this will give you the ability to see which articles are being promoted more.
The yellow bar is the time that article spent on the home page also. So you can get a sense of, okay, so we're seeing different traffic patterns. Why was that? If we're seeing a spike, how can we then go down and kind of investigate why that spike happened? And the other kind of the novel piece of data collection we're doing is these kind of Twitter shares and Facebook shares over time, which you normally can't get. But kind of the part of the platform, it goes and kind of queries that on a regular basis, so you can see those kind of time patterns and pick out different spikes and what might have been a meaningful event.
And then finally, I guess the last thing,
Yeah.
go back one. On the same view, you also see all of these events that you had approved for this article in the previous view. So now you're able to, in sort of one interface, see both quantitative indicators as well as these qualitative indicators. This is just a view that sort of similarly shows you where traffic is coming from. Once again, we're always emphasizing sort of comparison points, so you can see the gray lines. I think another sort of like design point is that each of our sort of prompts for a different metric are formed as a question. This is something that we picked up from Melody Kramer at NPR, and we think was a pretty successful way to allow users to navigate what can be kind of confusing metrics.
That's generally, yeah, and when you can also kind of create an event here. So if you didn't have a recipe that triggered an alert, you just kind of said, oh, we heard of this thing that happened. You can create an event from this screen, and that will kind of go, in this bottom area here. So that's generally everything. You have this diagram in the report that is probably easier to see printed, but it just kind of lays out all the different things that we're tracking and kind of the components of the platform and how they relate to each other. So the very left things are all kind of the settings, and then you see stories, recipes, and kind of how they then create impact events. And I believe that's it.
Yeah, you press down. They, no?
Cool. Yeah, so I think we'll invite our panelists up, and yeah, and then we'll do questions after the panel.
Let's do questions
Oh, do quick? Yeah.
Yeah.
Forgive me, I have a story going in the paper tomorrow, so I might have to leave and do some copy editing. So, pardon me. Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming. Maybe you could just quickly kind of introduce yourselves. I think
I'm Lindsay Greenbarber. I'm the Media Impact Analyst at the Center for Investigative Reporting in California and also an ACLS postdoctoral fellow there for now.
My name is Sarah Maslanier. I'm a staff reporter at the New York Times.
well, sir, maybe we could start with you and just kind of walk through. I think everyone is probably familiar with the story you just published on nail salons.
Everyone in the world.
Everyone in the world, I think. That's what I was reading
Everyone.
today. But if they aren't, just maybe kind of recap what the story was and maybe your experience with it and the impact that it had.
Sure. My experience with the reporting or the...
Yeah, I think the reporting, kind of the process of coming about it, and then kind of the aftermath that you're now in.
The story was called The Price of Nice Nails, and then the second one was Pretty Nails Poisoned Workers. The series is called Unvarnished, and it is pulled back or wiped off the polish of a really hideous exploitation within New York City's nail salons. So nail salon workers, the entire business is predicated on the exploitation of the workers. I found that the national average price of a manicure is $22. The price of a manicure in New York City is, on average, Manhattan, $10. So here in the most expensive city in the country, practically, where a latte is $4, we're paying these ridiculously low prices, and the reason why is because the worker doesn't get paid. So if you could sum up Unvarnished in one way, it would say there's no such thing as a cheap luxury. The cost of your discount is being borne by the worker in this industry, and I think it's applicable to a lot of different industries, which I'm sure you investigated. And then the second piece was about the chemical impact to the workers. So it's super interesting is when I told people I was working on a story about nail salon health, very few people, only a couple trusted friends, it wasn't allowed, they would say, oh yeah, they're so dirty and dingy and I'm going to get a fine. I said, no, not your health, the workers' health. Because of the way the federal law is constructed that governs cosmetics, food gets pre-market testing. Obviously your banana bread's not going to kill you. Drugs get pre-market testing. But cosmetic chemicals get no pre-market testing. The law was written in 1938, and I'm talking about the shampoo you put on your hair, the shaving cream you use. And while we're all affected by the fact that the European Union bans 1,300 cosmetic chemicals, and the U.S. bans 11. So we're putting stuff on our skin and our faces and our nails that is banned in Europe. You and I are affected by it, but the worker who sits exposed to it 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, as many of them are, it's a different order of magnitude, and these women have burning throats, painful eyes, bloody noses that just don't stop, and more serious problems like there's this specter of miscarriage that runs through the industry and of cancer. So these two stories made up Unvarnished, and the response was kind of nuts.
So actually, I mean, there's one thing was the governor has issued created this task force to look at it. The other question, well, aside from that, I think that's really interesting. But one thing you mentioned of kind of talking to your friends about it is this is also a story that's affected kind of people's personal habits and lives, apart from the legislative and government side. What have you seen, either just in your personal experience of talking to people about it, or kind of on a wider scale, sampling what how it affects everyone's daily routine in that way, and how do you collect that?
So I've been racking my brains to understand why it had such a huge impact, and I'll talk about the impact a tiny bit. Within 3 days of being published online, it wasn't even in the paper. And actually, it was really interesting because we published a slight delay in the paper to follow reader habits. Readers read online more on the weekdays and paper on the weekends. And we were worried we would have to put that everything changed right alongside the second article. It still wasn't even up. So the governor made New York nail salons went from having almost no health requirements to having some of the strictest in the nation. Salons now have to be bonded so that they have an insurance against defrauding workers. In order to be a salon, you have to have this, and there have been multiple changes to how salons are run. And in terms of impact, racking my brains, why did this happen? Why was there such a response? I mean, we read plenty of articles that don't have this kind of, it was a global trending topic on Twitter. The views are in the millions, where usually our views are in the hundreds of thousands, if we're lucky. And I think the fundamental reason is that the nature of manicure is a fundamentally intimate act. Actually, in academia, it's called intimate labor. You're holding hands with a woman. You're looking into her eyes. And I really think that this story showed that we just weren't seeing them. And while you can bring yourself really to care about the worker in Abu Dhabi who builds NYU and is enslaved in that campus, you don't hold their hand. You don't touch their skin. You don't ask them who they are. And it turns out they were giving you a lie. Oh, I'm fine. I have 2 kids. Well, you live piled up 12 to a 1-bedroom. And I think that impact, I've heard people just, it's unbearable for them to continue doing what they were doing, their daily routines. And I think they're changing their habits. And I think that's a huge impact. I know I have.
I'm curious, feel free.
Right? Look at us.
I actually
Literally the last
manicure
I got was before I read her story.
I'm curious, Sarah,
Yes.
what went into the process sort of pre-publishing, like whether you anticipated this in any way, and if so, what you did to sort of, amplify that impact. I know, for instance, that the story was published in multiple languages. What was the sort of motivation there?
Sure. So I had the idea to publish in multiple languages. It came on 2 fronts. One, I did a story in McDonald's about Korean elders hanging out in McDonald's, and they were getting arrested because they hung out there too long. And it went wild in Korea. They just took the New York Times article, put it through Google Translate, and put it on their front pages. And it really bothered me. I said, why should we be doing their journalism for them? Why shouldn't we get those clicks? And the other part of that was the women themselves work too hard to know their own stories. I found out there was a race-based caste system in salons that governed hiring, that governed compensation. But I found it out. Those women didn't know it. Nobody told me. I pieced it together. And then I started asking the right questions. And they just work too much to know that they're part of a system that depends on their exploitation. And I felt like we needed to tell them their story. There was a journalistic reason to do so. So I asked if it was translated, and we already started an initiative to translate stuff. And actually, Michael Luo, my editor, to his credit, we had a big meeting about translating, and people said, well, how can we translate the Twitter and the Facebook? And everybody's getting kind of like hands off it. And then Michael just said, this is the direction that news is going. Why don't we use this story as an opportunity to experiment? Why don't we pull out all the stops and try it? And we had the comments translated. We had Twitter posts in translation. We had different, you could click and it was like lire en español and however you say it in Korean. And we really pulled out all the stops as an experiment, and I think it was wildly successful. The 3rd highest trending article on the New York Times site the first day was the Korean version of Nice Nails.
Well, something you said reminded me, I think maybe Blair can speak to this, of it's a story that kind of caught on because it was kind of an intimate story, and kind of at the Marshall Project, we weren't familiar with it, about kind of criminal justice. The idea there is, how do you tap into kind of an audience, and maybe you can speak to kind of how that's been going over the past few years of kind of understanding how the story relates to a niche group like that.
So we're in sort of a unique position because we are a single subject newsroom, but we sort of have a 2-fold goal. So one is to elevate and amplify the general conversation about criminal justice, and the other is to produce journalism that will have an impact within that system. But the audiences for those 2 end results are quite different. So our challenge is, how do you write stories about what is oftentimes a very wonky process? Like in the criminal justice system, a lot of what goes wrong happens before you even get to prison. It's about laws, and it's about plea bargains and what happens in court. How do you get a general audience who might not be able to connect with that in an intimate way to care about it and talk about it? And how do you bring that down to them? And then on the other side, how do you create content that is in-depth enough to feed the policy side and the lawyers and the judges and everybody who thinks about this every day. So for us, it was interesting too, because we launched back in November, and it was 20 people coming from different newsrooms that all did things in different ways. So there was sort of a launch time where we all said, okay, how do we produce something? Like, what is our workflow for getting something on our website? So once that got ironed out, then we took a step back and said, okay, what's actually happening now? And we put in place an outcome tracker, and we talk about it at our monthly review meetings, and the outcomes go in our daily analytics email. And we are now at the point where we're trying to replicate, okay, what made this audience, general audience, grasp onto this story? And a lot of times we're seeing when they are more personal and when they have a more sympathetic character, that takes off more there. What made this get in front of the right policymakers? So that's what we have been kind of trying to figure out and replicate.
Like different versions, or just different frames, different takes, I guess, would be a way to think about it.
I think it would be, we haven't quite gotten to that point yet, right? The way that I've been thinking about it, this is me speaking as me and not necessarily as the Marshall Project, is we know that there are certain communities we want to reach, because I'm the audience editor, right? So I'm saying, how do we build community and engage the readers in what we're doing? So why don't we go ask them? So I think an example would be, one of our impact items is when a school has used our material in its curriculum. And when it happens, right now our response is, oh, that's great. How did you find it? But what if we went and talked to 30 high school teachers in New York and said, how do you use criminal justice news in the classroom? Is this something that you talk about? Like, why or why not? Organize, create community spaces, devise content that will appeal to them. So it's sort of like R&D and then content creation. It's like a logic model, right?
Very cool. So the other side of it, Lindsay, I want to ask you about, because you've been working in this space for a number of years now, and I think you can talk to me a bit about the other side of kind of foundations and funders and how they play into the impact question. You know, the thing that many places are producing reports for, what effect does that have, and how has that changed over the past few years?
Yeah, I hope my answer doesn't disappoint you. But when I got to CIR 2 years ago, I'm not a journalist by training also, so please forgive me if I say the wrong thing. But I think it was seen as being something that we were doing for foundations, and we were doing for funders. We're a philanthropically funded nonprofit organization. And I wasn't particularly interested in fundraising, and I thought it was a super wasted opportunity to spend all of our time figuring out how can we do evaluation of this project to report back to a funder, and what if we took this work when we're trying to address injustices that we're uncovering and really pinpoint where the problems are, so that the problems can then be addressed in some way, whether it be through policy or whether it be through community activation or network growth or through education in schools, or whatever the kind of right approach is, and use that to then inform the way that we're telling our stories, the way that we're engaging with our audiences, and the way that we're distributing our content. And a big piece of that was moving away from analytics, and foundations were asking for reporting about impact, and then asking oftentimes for traditional ad metrics, and to CIR that felt kind of wrong, because they didn't see that as equating impact, right? Impact was the governor responding, and potentially the millions of page views as well, if that means that then the folks who read the story stopped getting manicures, or start actually asking the right questions, which I thought was really awesome, that you had like the questions that you should ask and kind of that solutions bar. That was really wonderful. And so we started tracking more of those types of things to try to strategize around our content a bit more. But the response from foundations, on the other hand, has been really incredible. I think that they were equally frustrated with ad metrics as impact value, and so I think finding the way to say what's the relationship, which is part of what NewsLynx does, right? It's what's the relationship between ad metrics and this offline change that we're all actually trying to kind of get to or understand better. And so working through some of that we've done in a few case studies, the response for us has been really great. And we've had the opportunity and I'd say the privilege to work with some other organizations and do similar work. And so it's been really, I think, a really exciting 2 years, and I think that the field as a whole has made progress in terms of it going from something kind of overly simplistic to being something that we realize maybe there's no one metric, but that's okay too, that there might be different ways to understand impact.
Do you have any questions, or should we open it up?
Yeah, well, how are you doing on time, Fergus?
How are we doing on
You
time?
can go on. This is a fascinating conversation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd be curious, Sarah, like, you sort of pulled out a couple of things, or like a couple of things popped out to me. You said, like, it was the third highest trending article. There was, like, millions of page views. Like, are these things that that going into your next story you would use to measure your success, or is it more like something that happened and is an added bonus?
Yeah, I mean, that's the danger of all this great stuff, right? That we start thinking about page views and impact, and maybe we decide what our stories are going to be based on our projected clickable outcomes. And that's a huge danger because there's nothing sexy about three-quarter houses, for example, Kim Barker's story. It doesn't have the same universal fascination as maybe nail salons do because everybody gets their nails done, and not everybody is a homeless person getting fed drugs. If you read that story, it's really rad. That's the risk, and it's not a risk at the New York Times because we have an incredibly deep ethic of tell the story that needs to be told. I've actually asked Arthur Sulzberger this, and he like laughs in your face. He's like, what are you talking? He's like, no. He's like, we're gonna do good journalism, like, click schmicks, I think there is a danger of, the leaderboard at Gawker, right, that everybody hears about that they have, or I don't know if they still have it, but they had for a while, people's stories with your name, how many clicks you got, and you had to aspire to be at the top of that leaderboard. You have to fight the mental leaderboard in order to tell the stories that need to be told.
A small plug for another Tao research project by Caitlin Petrie that came out last month about Gawker and their use of metrics. If you haven't read that, the traffic factories is really, really interesting.
It's called Traffic Factories?
The traffic factories, yeah. What you just said is super interesting. It's very much like a dialectic in that the more you have something that has impact, you will still then need to say, all right, what are the stories that we've done that have not really had the same effect, and how can we promote
Every
them?
story,
It's
my whole
always
career.
it's always yeah. Whenever you have a metric, almost like an anti-metric of what is not represented in this as we keep going.
I mean, at the base of all of this has to be old school journalism, or else it all caves in on itself. You have to have old school ethics, you have to have old school values and old school news values, and then this stuff, makes it blossom. But I think, you're doing a terrific job in taking that step to the next level. But you do need a sort of a touchstone that you can keep track of, and I think that touchstone is the values taught in this school and the values held by my company and your organization.
Great. Well, yeah.
So we will go to questions, and while you're thinking about questions, I've got one for Lindsay. So I've heard something about kind of a before and after survey project that you've done. If you could just talk a little bit about that, I think it'd be really fascinating. And in the meantime, just put your hand up if you've got a question.
Yeah, so this is where I came into me, like thinking about impact just as this thing that happens afterwards and trying to use an evaluative approach is problematic for lots of reasons, but one of them is that you often don't have the baseline. So when you're trying to think about, how much change is a result of this one project, that if you don't know what the situation was before, other than anecdotally, it's really hard to know if you had influence. And it paired alongside that at CIR, there's a real commitment by the organization to tell stories around vulnerable populations. One of the challenges with that in investigative reporting is that often vulnerable populations don't have a lot of data around them. And in an environment that is really, really excited, and for good reason, about data reporting and all the possibilities that presents, it presents a challenge when we want to tell stories about vulnerable communities, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and, which I want to talk to you about later. But, and so I said, well, why don't we create primary data? Like if there's a community that isn't represented and we can't get data about it, what if we ask the questions? What if we design a survey and we just go out and do it? And the reporter's like, that's great, but we don't have the resources. And I was like, I'm right here, I can help. That's what I do. So we did. And there was a project that came out last fall called The Dark Side of the Strawberry, and it was around the fumigant industry in strawberries, specifically in California. You should check it out and talk about like chemicals that are banned in Europe and not in the United States. It's true for the food industry as well. And again, low-wage workers, like a lot of similarities. But the reporters, when they were doing their door knocking in Southern California, said, you know, it seems like no one knows that fumigants are being used. Like people think they've been outlawed. And so this idea came up, well, what if we just go ask people if they know? So we designed a survey. We worked with USC Annenberg School, and we actually went door to door last April and administered the survey. We also did, it was a lot of pieces, but found that in fact people had no idea this was happening by and large. We also asked some questions during that activity about how people get news and information on their local communities. We figured probably in Oxnard, 77% Spanish speaking, smaller city in California, people aren't visiting CIR's website for content. We partnered with The Guardian for that, but we figured, not even sure, you know, might not be reading that as well. Where should we put the story to make sure that that community got the information? As a result of that, the project came out. It was a big hit. It was translated into Spanish also and distributed locally. And we partnered with the Ventura County Star, which is the local newspaper, to print a shorter version. And actually, we have a partnership with a theater in San Francisco, and they produced a one-act play, and it's a bilingual play in both Spanish and English. And they went to a high school in Oxnard, Rio Mesa High School, that's surrounded on all sides by strawberry fields, and worked with a drama class to produce the one-act play for the community there. So it had a lot of elements, but that survey helped us think about how to write the story, you know, how much knowledge should we assume the reader has, how should we distribute it in the community and engage there, and then next week we'll send a follow-up survey out to try to gauge, do people know more, hopefully. But we'll find out, and there will be questions that, you know, how did you hear about this? And so hopefully we can also gauge our own strategies so that we know next time, you know, what worked, maybe what didn't work as well.
In the red shirt.
Sarah, how long did your project take you from beginning to end? And have you gone back to any of the people you interviewed to see the impact your stories have had on their lives?
Yeah, so it took 13 months, my project, and I was reporting up to the last millisecond, which was really intense. And actually a really interesting incident, like right before it came out, there was only one person in the story who didn't use their name, which I'm very proud of people using their names, but the one person. And I went to her with a piece of the story and tried to say, look, this is what I'm going to say about you. What do you think? And I saw her breath sort of catch, and I saw a freak out happening, and I was like, don't worry about it, and I walked away. She flipped out on the other manicurists in the story, and one called me up the hours before we pressed go, and she said, Sarah, what have you done? I'm being cursed. My husband says, and I said, you know, Nancy Ottavallo, I said, we've talked about this. You knew you were going to be in the story, you know, and she said, but I'm getting distressed. And I said, well, look, you know, do you still value telling the story? And she was crying, and she said, whatever you do, keep my name in, which I thought was just a brilliant moment. I mean, this woman has everything to lose, but she got it. So I was reporting up to the last minute. In terms of the impact, I haven't actually spoken to Nancy, that particular one, because I'm a little bit, I'm frightened her world is a bit turned upside down, and I want to give her a little time, a little space for it to resettle, because I know it will. She has an open door to me if anything's problematic. I told her, I'll write about, whatever happens to you, I'll write about it. That's the best I can do, but I think that's something. In terms of Jing Ren and Michelle, the two protagonists of the first story, they got offered a job, actually, as photojournalists, because Michelle has a really amazing Instagram feed, which maybe is a story that she looks, in her Instagram feed, she looks like she lives at the Ritz-Carlton. She has melon balls carved out into a champagne glass, and it looks incredible. And only I know that that champagne glass rests on a broken cabinet door that she uses for a table. And so they present this life. So they're moving up in the world because they're unusual characters. They have, I said the other day that Michelle would be a Fortune 500 CEO if only she had another chance at life. And so they're all, I think, doing okay.
So should I go ahead and ask another question? This one is from Michael and Brian. And actually, just a quick question on you. Are you going to make this available to companies, to organizations, et cetera? And then for the panelists, I'm wondering, are you guys going to adopt this? And if so, how are you going to use it? So first for you guys.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a product of it being funded by the Tao Center and the Tao Center via the Knight Foundation, it's completely open license. And we are currently sort of cleaning it up and making it as usable to other people. But yeah, the entire project is open source. And
You should
so,
sell it. Open source.
well, so I mean, I have particular feelings about that. Basically, that there, if you're trusting your metrics to a black box company, you never know where those metrics are actually coming from, and you get into a situation where many organizations try to make sense of their metrics from Google Analytics or Chartbeat or from whatever Comcast. And they're never able to reconcile them, and no one knows why. So one of the things I think that we emphasize in the report is the importance of open source in this realm for actually understanding where these things come from, how the sort of metric sausage gets made. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. So it will be open source and free to use for people.
Yeah. It's on our GitHub, github.com/newslinks. Has all of our repositories. There's quite a few, and some of them are ones that we're not using anymore. So we're going to be at a conference in Minneapolis called SourceCon, SRCCON. It's about kind of open source journalism, and that'll kind of be our code launch. So pretty soon. Yeah, and just echo what Brian said. One of the anecdotes that's in the paper is kind of on many of our Google Analytics accounts, all of the metrics came back in like multiples of 12, which is just like insane.
Yeah.
And insane if you're running your business on that type of thing. And so one of the things that really got us into passionate about this project is, there should be an open platform for doing this. And I think it vibes with what journalism is, and what kind of an organization who is doing an investigation in the public interest. Kind of all parts of that pipeline are kind of open and out there, and hopefully we can build kind of a community. Since, as we also talked about in the report, Google Analytics falls out of favor. We need a new kind of module to do that, and kind of with a lot of people looking at the problem and actively solving it, hopefully we can get something.
So the other part of the question was, I think, for the panel. And I know, Lindsay, you've been using it, but talking about maybe how these kind of tools would integrate with your own workflows and situations.
So it's two things. The main kind of tool, we use Google Analytics and a slew of other kind of analytics platforms. And then I think in the paper too, it mentions that I built an application it's just a database to collect this qualitative information, to create qualitative data sets around our content that our reporters are responsible for completing. It's just a part of their normal workflow. And we're actually building a custom built tool because it was built in Podio, just because that was what we were using for our workflow. And that tool will be available in the fall, but that's all it is. It's just to capture offline impact. That's it. But it will have an API, and it will be open source, but so it could interface, in the recipe with, if offline impact, it could feed into that, or with whatever other platform you're using. And we did use NewsLynx for a while in the beginning, but we've since essentially moved over to Reveal. I'm going to do a shameless plug. It is our investigative news audio show. It's radio and podcast. Check it out. It's really cool. But our RSS feed went down for like a month in the shift from CIR to Reveal, because it's an all-new site. And at that point, we lost essentially, we lost 1 month of data in NewsLynx. But also NewsLynx is URL-based, so if you produce a lot of content, so if you have many URLs associated with essentially the same story, it becomes a little bit tricky, which, I mean, we've talked about it, that this is not a surprise. But so it became a little bit difficult, and because I lost that month, it just was going to take me a long time to kind of go back and rejigger things. But while we were using it, it was really great.
Yeah, it's definitely something like we spoke with broadcast organizations that have, a version of the story that goes up on air, a version of the story online. How are those two related? And that's kind of a really interesting hierarchy problem that we haven't figured out yet. And
there's a lot of things that we learned in the sort of process of working with organizations like CIR that we would have never even conceived of. I mean, I never would have conceived of an organization staging a one-act play as a part of their journalistic endeavors, and that makes it really hard to build a platform like this to encompass all of the amazing things that organizations are doing in this sort of new landscape of media. But hopefully we figure some of those things out before we release it.
Hi, I'm Sarah Garland. I'm the executive editor of the Hechinger Report, and we're also a single issue nonprofit. And I've been thinking about a lot of this stuff for the past 2 or 3 years. And let's see if I can articulate my question. One of the frustrations that we have is that, and you guys sort of talked about this, is that what we really, at least, especially for us, we do investigative work, but that's not our primary focus. A lot of our work is explanatory journalism. And so what we care about is what's happening in our readers' brains. It's this very elusive, did we change people's minds? Are they thinking about an issue differently? We're not necessarily changing policy every day. We're writing about new policies and how they're working. And so I think this survey model seems really interesting, but even in a story like Sarah, you had the Cuomo action, but then you had, the conversations with my friends on Facebook for saying, well, should I boycott or should I, go and just tip really well in cash and get my nails done anyway? And I think those are really interesting, getting into readers and how they're reacting. And are readers boycotting nail salons, or are they tipping more? How do you get at those kinds of impacts, which I think are really interesting. And so I'm just wondering, it seems like even with these new systems, we're still measuring the things that we can capture online, like media citations. That's really easy to do Google search and so on. But how do you systematize, finding out what's going on in readers' brains? I think that's the question that we struggle with the most. And I don't know, can you do a survey with every story? How do you make that something that you can actually do on a regular basis?
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation we've had, Blair, about kind of impact as a self-replicating, but sustaining community.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I think, a lot of the current discussion around impact revolves around what happened because of this story, but not a lot of what we hear about and talk about is what are people talking about because of it and what's going on in our community. So what Michael is talking about goes back to a project I did at ProPublica, which was around patient harm. The investigation still hasn't come out, and this started 3 years ago. But we made it was a mini splendored sort of community engagement project, but the anchor was a Facebook group for people who had been harmed in hospitals and their families, and also providers and other journalists if they so chose to join. And when we started it, the thought was, this would be a great way to build audience, and hopefully we can get some sources out of it, and we'll do a little reporting out of it. But what we saw, partially because we had such a long time, was the people in that group previously had no way to interact with one another. And so when they came to that group, they were talking about these issues that affect people, because this is a thing that follows you long after you've left the doctor's office. It affects every part of your life. And the group and the discussions they were having sort of became impactful on its own, independently of the project. So it would be things like, oh, I need a medical malpractice lawyer in Virginia. Can you help me? And there would be a lot of advice given. Or there were a couple instances where people even, there was a post, it would be, my mom is in a hospital in another state. She's calling me, freaking out. I can't get a hold of her. I don't know what's going on. And the group like leapt into action, and they started literally calling the hospital. And the woman who originally posted was like, I just, got a call from a nurse on the 4th floor of this hospital who said that your mother wasn't. It was incredible to watch. But it was also something that would only be seen if you were in there reading the comments every day, and you really get to know these people. And it doesn't speak to the problem of offline. How do you create a survey, which I would love to know how to do, and if you have any tips on systematizing that, that would be great. But I do think the concept of comments and online forums not just being a thing that you tack on to the end of the article, but a thing that you create specifically to monitor reader response and to fill a void for them can be a really powerful thing. And it'll vary based on your coverage and what you need. But
can I just jump in with a thought? I guess I don't understand the point of monitoring whether you've changed readers' ideologies or ideas. I mean, so what? If you find out you didn't, then you're going to do a different story that might have a better impact on changing their minds, and then you're going to forgo other stories that you might have done because it might be in the same vein of the one that didn't work. I think that's a slippery slope and dangerous ground, to mix tons of metaphors. I mean, I understand measuring impact. I don't understand getting so deep in the reader's mind, because why? Is it going to change your journalism? And if the answer is yes, I think that's dangerous for journalism.
Well, I think there are two different types of journalism. So one thing that might speak to that, for example, is we just created a series of 5 very short videos, animated videos, in collaboration with AJ Plus, which is Al Jazeera's millennial network, and uploaded them to Facebook. The goal of that was to get people to think differently about solitary confinement, in that they now understand what it is.
Right, but imagine if you do that survey and you find out now they don't think differently about solitary confinement. Are you just not going to tell more solitary confinement stories if the agenda is to change minds? Are you going to choose topics?
Not necessarily change minds, but to change the way that they think about it and understand it. So the goal of an investigation like what you did, or we covered.
There's advocacy journalism and there's not, but I just.
Well, I'm not saying advocacy journalism, but
I think rather than, sorry if I can just jump in for a second, I think rather than not select the story, it would be like maybe partnering with AJ Plus and doing short videos wasn't the right strategy to tell that story for that audience.
Right.
So not that you're not going to do the story, but instead are we telling the story in the most effective way, which some of us have to really think hard about, and you all have this huge benefit of having a platform that reaches a lot of people.
But we think about it too.
Yeah, no, totally. But you're always going to reach a really big audience. And when I know, especially when I got to CIR and it was a syndicated model, we didn't have Reveal. It was every piece of content we put out was through a partnership. And so this was one of the ways we could assess the quality of particular partnerships in terms of reaching audiences and things. So we always did the story, and choosing the partnership actually used to come quite late in the process. But so this was one of the ways we could kind of incorporate something into that calculus of who should the partner be on this piece of content.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a student at CUNY, and I just have a question both within NewsLynx and for you guys. How do you measure negative impact of stories? Sometimes stories don't have the positive impact that and we focus on all these positive things, changing laws, but what happens when you have a story that gets somebody fired? How do you measure that impact so that you can balance it with the positive impact?
Get you yourself as a journalist fired, or?
No, I mean
like all the manicurists in New York fired.
The nail salon workers fired because they were in the story. How is there a way in NewsLynx to be this was a negative, this was a negative media mention because we actually plagiarized the story and now everybody's calling us out for it. That would show up with a lot of media citations, but it would be for the wrong reason. Is there a way to tag it in that, and then have you guys in your reports deal with those moments when things don't go well?
Yeah, I think technologically the simple answer would be, they could make a tag that was got called out or something, or
Yeah,
we made
plagiarized.
an error. And that would actually be, we haven't thought of that before. That would be a really.
That's
thing
why
to
we
talk
allow
about.
you to specify the tags.
Yeah, if you know, our goal is to decrease the mentions of that. So yeah, that's the technological answer, but that's not super interesting. 'Cause technology's not that interesting. But in terms of other,
Yeah, I think there's a footnote in the paper about this sort of issue of the entire discussion around media impact is usually assuming that media has an impact or that it has a positive impact. There's all sorts of research that says otherwise. So I think that one thing that we tried to do as much as possible was not to impose a particular ideology of impact upon our platform, but leave that up to you. And depending on your level of honesty as an organization or a journalist, you can include things like that or you cannot.
I think also, rather than think of impact as like a thing that happens on this day, that it's a process, right? So it's a process of change, and bad things happening are probably part of that process. And I think often negative impact might be some of the most powerful things that happen. But again, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the entire process. And I think there's an investigation we did into a housing unit in Richmond, California. Is a public housing space for mostly elderly and disabled folks. And it was just like horrendous living conditions, really terrible. The investigation came out, and the discussion before was, but what happens if this closes? Like, where are these, because there was a community there also, like, were people going to be split up? And so that became a part of the story. The reporters kind of anticipated that, and it was like a multi-part story. And that was one of the pieces of like, what will happen next? These are some of the options. So that then when there was a city council meeting about it and people showed up, like that was a piece of the conversation. And then the reporters stayed with it. So when the city like vowed, okay, we're going to close this and move people, that was part of the follow-up story, was where are they being moved, to kind of make sure that that was really front and center in people's minds, so that, when you're, in Berkeley and you're outraged that this is happening, that you're not just thinking, oh, success because they're shutting down the home, but they're thinking, what's happening next? Where are these people going to be? And really making those characters be front and center in the mind, and it not just be this institutional kind of thing that was going to happen.
Hi.
I have two questions, and they're mostly for Michael and Brian, but if you guys could speak to it too, that'd be great. My first question is actually from earlier on when you were talking about categories and levels. What is the difference between change and achievement?
oh yeah,
And then the other question was, in measuring impact, how does that change across video, audio, print, online? And what happens when they're all or a couple of different ones are put together? And how is that measured?
Yeah, good question. So as we go into in the paper, the idea for categories and levels came from Chalkbeat, an education site, and then levels we graciously took from Lindsay, who has a system of 3 levels at CIR that we thought was a really great way to think about it. The citation is just someone talk about you. Achievement is more of like a meta category, like did it win an award, or did it get the most X of all of our things.
Like Sarah saying it was the 3rd highest trending piece, that would be like an achievement.
Yeah, something like that. The other question is a really good one, and it's one that we haven't figured out yet, and I think we would want to keep iterating on kind of different use cases for it. So similar to just, you have a broadcast piece, you have a web piece. For organization A, they might be a one-to-one. Organization B, it might be they're totally separate, but they're on a similar topic, but weren't coordinated together. Do you count those metrics as one? Are they like repeat? Is the web audience different from the TV audience, or is a video view? Is it a partial view?
Or even if one institution uses more than one medium
Yeah.
to go about telling a story.
And I think it's what we found is the bottleneck is both in kind of, is there organizational clarity on how those pieces of content and reporting do interact with each other, and then if there is, how do you kind of systematize that or problematize that within something that you can program? And we haven't figured out in the way that we kind of think that the categories and levels, it gives us both freedom for an organization to define its own goals, but still make cross comparisons. We haven't figured out what that would be for different content types or versions of a story in different platforms, but yeah, it's really interesting. I imagine the way forward would be, starting with a small organization that kind of has a handle on it and implementing that, seeing if it works, seeing if it then can be broadened out. Yeah.
Also, sorry, just real quick, if you go to impact.cironline.org, there's an interactive glossary that has the levels, how we think about it, and you can play around with it and stuff. I apologize for its rudimentary nature, but.
First of all, thanks so much, all of you, for being here. My question, I guess, is mostly towards Michael and Brian, or anybody who can take a shot at it. But comparatively speaking, NewsLynx aside, we've had so much, we have so much more data on audiences compared to 5 years ago, and exponentially more than compared to 10 years ago for online readership. And I was wondering, as companies are able to get more and more data, do you think that impact measurement, such as NewsLynx, will eventually become the norm, or do you think that NewsLynx is always going to be kind of its own unique thing outside of Google Analytics and Chartbeat, or do you think all the other more mainstream organizations will eventually accept this type of measurement as well?
I think probably the limiting factor will be that we have to sleep at certain parts of the day. Brian and I have full-time day jobs apart from this. So I think part of the idea is, as a community, I think what we like about the platform is it can be used by not just the nonprofit investigative, but any organization that wants to essentially have a great notebook for keeping track of its stuff. We had a conversation almost a year ago about kind of archiving news apps and kind of interactives, and you run into a lot of the same problems of, we have a story, we want to record how it did and what the story was about that story. So I think in wanting to kind of open source it and make it modular, at least parts of it can be useful where they are in kind of an ecosystem.
So I guess my answer would be that we're not trying to solve the problems of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian. To solve those problems, you need massive resources, infrastructure. Those require money, and so let the for-profit companies solve their problems. The problem is that there will never be a for-profit company that will try to solve Lindsay's problem, because Lindsay can't pay them. So
my own organization hasn't even been paying me for that.
The point is that if we let the entire analytics industry be driven by the interests of the few, then the interests of the many will subside and be forgotten about.
And not for nothing, this has a huge impact with journalistic prizes. I think you could market it as, look, now you can really present a huge package to prizes that can fund organizations that come with a financial award. This is the stuff that the Pulitzer Committee looks at, but in a less sophisticated way.
Right.
And the tremendous work these groups are doing, you could say, look, here's our impact, here's the resonance that this had. And that's part of your prize package, and elevating, the small guys to being able to show that strawberry story had, tremendous waves.
I mean, I guess a sort of corollary point to that would be in the same way that, when you begin to measure something, you begin to optimize for those metrics that, that you could see some sort of strange negative externalities from trying to optimize for impact metrics. So every time you write a story, you're like, okay, which bill can I target to get passed as quickly as possible so that, my category change level institution metrics go up. And so I think that's the side effect of all of this that you have to be careful about, is that if you just replace one metric paradigm with another metric paradigm, you haven't really solved the problem of metrics, you've just created new ones.
Yeah, I think that's why it's also super important not to think of the different kinds of impact as hierarchical, where a law is the ultimate goal that we're trying to reach, and why try really hard not to talk about levels but types instead, even though it makes me sound really wonky and things. But it's because there can always be backsliding, right? You can pass a law, but, you know, is it enforced? Like, there are so many other levels.
Like what the governor's doing with Nelson. I haven't seen any changes. I've just heard about them.
Right. And so I think that's, it's a challenge to change that framework and to change the way that we all think about social and political change. I think that just because a law is passed or a reform is made, that's not the end of change and the end of history or something, but rather that might just be the beginning. And just to kind of, sorry.
I had an interesting conversation. I was in Sacramento on a reporting trip last week, and when I was waiting for an interview to start, I was speaking with a legislative director and just saying about what I did, and I was mentioning this project. And when I said that, you know, journalists really look at legislative change as something that they was like, wow, that was substantial, she literally laughed. Because from her perspective, she saw everything that goes into that legislation and its shortcomings and just the battles and the compromises, and thought, wow, you actually care about that? And on one level, it's a bit disingenuous because obviously laws do matter, but, you know, it is not the end of the line, and kind of evaluating, all right, what effect did that law have? Did that, and in some ways it can never end, but, you know, figuring out at least where you stand is then where you can then build that narrative and kind of go at least have something from it. Yeah.
Hello, Ross Tapsell, an academic in media studies from Australia. I was wondering, just your comment about the many and the few before. It sounded like you could say something about academia and how scholars measure impact and Google Analytics. Could an academic use NewsLynx? Have you looked at how academia uses Google Analytics, and do you criticize that? I imagine there's a lot of...
Well, there's actually a really similar movement going on in academia, this thing called altmetrics, and there's even a platform called Impact Story. So I think it's a very similar problem in terms of citations and sort of journal ratings being the only things that academics have to go off of, and then these being numbers that drive tenure decisions. I don't think, NewsLynx is definitely composed with the idea that you're putting a specific type of content and you're trying to measure specific things about it. I don't know if it would work for it. It would be an interesting sort of curveball to throw it to see if it could, but there definitely are some really cool projects out there already grappling with the same issue.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
My question is for Brian and Michael. If you think that the system, if it's somewhat geared towards immediacy, I mean, for things that are happening in the next few days or months, because I mean, Snowden and the Guardian story had a direct impact just last week, 2 years after, and Andrew Jennings' report on FIFA like a decade after. So how do you keep monitoring years and months after the story? How is it possible, both technologically and like as a philosophy on the newsroom?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the straight metrics, a lot of the stories you would have that kind of typical pattern where it levels off. I think one of the useful things is that, if the story is in your system, it's just like a digital notebook, then you could just kind of keep going back to it, and it's all kind of in one place. You could just add that event if, a year later, something new happens.
Yeah, I guess technologically speaking, one thing that we didn't think much about when we first built it was, what happens from just a storage perspective if you're collecting metrics 6, 7, 8 months after they're published for every single article that's published. Some of the newsrooms that we worked with, we sort of naively took many people to try it out. And some of them in the course of 8 months published 4,000 articles. They just let the river of AP articles flow through their CMS and right into NewsLynx, and that sort of caused some problems for us. So I think one thing that we are thinking about a lot before we release this sort of next version is, how do you simultaneously sort of say, okay, we're going to stop collecting metrics on this article at a certain point. In many cases, the half-life of some of these articles on the web is 2-3 days. You know, most of the attention is up front and immediate, and it gets sort of lost. But every now and then, something gets picked up again, and it's really important to know that. That's, you know, why you keep track of analytical and, you know, just sort of otherwise problem to figure out. But yeah.
Or you could have, like, I think one idea is you could just have it stop, and then if you really care, there's a button that's like, oh, hey, go and fetch the latest for this. You know, something there. If it's a technology solution, we'll probably figure something out. But yeah, if the other thing is if people want to contribute, that's the next step too.
Yeah.
I'm going to close it out now. Thank you so much, particularly Michael and Brian, but also Sarah, Lindsay, Blair. Sorry, my name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Town Centre here. I love the fact that this kind of movement here represents not just counting or measuring journalism, but kind of a subversive act against a kind of a movement that would see, as it were, you know, kind of us assessing or attaching value to kind of metrics in a certain way. I think people, you know, I've always found the application of metrics to journalism completely fascinating from the days when I used to sit sort of glued to an omniture dashboard. But it would be great to see people in this room who are interested in this contributing. It would be great to see the kind of the project going in whichever direction it can. But for now, thank you very much indeed for your great questions. It's started a fascinating conversation. If you haven't signed up to the town mailing list, please do. We have these kinds of events quite often up here. And if there's any wine left at all, go and grab it quickly. There are no students around at the moment, so you've got a couple of minutes. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank
Again,
you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad it's done.
Yeah, get my question.
No, I can't do it either. I love the manicures. But you know, the Times is really actively fighting for its audience. It doesn't rest on, which is weird, right?